Hello, welcome to my channel, Sea of Infinity. So in this video I just kind of wanted to talk about the idea of light and dark rather than light versus dark that can so commonly kind of be portrayed through certain ideas and media or what have you. There's so often such popular themes of this whole like light versus dark battle, even with like media and stuff, like movies like Harry Potter with Voldemort and Star Wars with Jedis and Darth Vader, or even just the idea through certain religion and things like that of with God and the devil, like this righteous battle of good versus bad. When really, it's light and dark. We are both light and dark. So to be an integrated whole, you need both light and dark, the yin and the yang. The devil is God, essentially, or, like God's shadow, if you will. There's nothing that exists outside of the whole. Nothing exists outside of God. Nothing exists outside of source. It is the infinite whole. And so that includes, what people would, like call the devil or, call the dark or what have you. It's all, all one complete thing. It's not like there's, some, bright sparkly God and then there's some evil dark devil. It's like that all is God. It all is source. It's all one. But through those sort of lenses and perspectives, we often can look at those sort of things. It's just been like split and fragmented, and then you have this whole battle debacle, when really it's about integrating and alchemizing the two together within yourself and outside of yourself. The darkness isn't bad, it just is, as anything else. It's how you wield it that can be bad, or toxic, but just as much as you can also have toxic light as well. When they're unhealed and unintegrated in those ways, then that can be used and expressed and represented in more sort of, toxic or unhealthy ways. But that's not like, the light or the dark itself is, fundamentally wrong or bad. They all have, a purpose to play in the whole picture. Kind of like that idea of keeping your heart open, but also keeping your spine strong, right? If you just, delving completely into the light and, become completely placid and passive, completely, peaceful and harmonious type sort of energy, then all that darkness that is being, suppressed and repressed, then, can be projected and manifested into something else that then takes on the role of all that darkness. Kind of like if you think of the idea of a super peaceful and placid village that may be really great and wonderful in one aspect, in that it's delving completely in the light, but then all that darkness that's being suppressed and repressed is then like another village nearby that's more of like a violent, chaotic warrior village that just comes through and, annihilates the peaceful village. And it's, zoomed out. They're just those two sides of the whole not being, integrated together in a, healthy sort of way, that instead they're kind of, lashing out in a way of opposing each other. You don't want, one side to be completely light and one side to be completely dark. You want everything to be integrated with light and dark in a balanced way, at least in this sort of, realm of existence, of that sort of duality and mirror type existence, where we do, have those opposites in the way that are always going to kind of, be reflected from the whole in that way, where you have up, you have down. So if you have, complete light, then you're going to have complete dark somewhere kind of, coming. Whereas if you have, light and dark integrated, then that reflects as light and dark integrated, over here as well. you know, kind of having that balance. Otherwise, you know, if you tip one way, that other way is still represented somewhere as something in, you know, in this sort of reality. And, you know, doing such sort of integration as well individually then helps, you know, collectively as a whole as well, because it's, you know, almost like we're all, you know, little nodes in the brain of the earth, you know, the brain, the consciousness of the earth, the brain, you know, if you imagined the earth being a brain, or the earth being like, you know, God, or, you know, a little God, like, you know, all different planets are their own sort of, you know, little brains in a greater universal brain. It's like, you know, we're all the little nodes of, you know, the earth brain doing its sort of integration and shadow work. We're then the little nodes and little fractals, you know, representing and reflecting that process. So, you know, it's not even just, you know, the earth itself, you know, doing that sort of work through us, but in a way that we are the earth itself doing that work. Just as, you know, from a zoomed out perspective, it might just look like the one brain, the one planet, you know, the earth doing that work. And then zoomed in, you know, it's like all the different nodes of the brain, you know, doing different little things as part of that process. And we're sort of all like the different little nodes, you know, in the brain doing that process. Except we have, you know, a bit more of that sort of individualized free will, where we're not just, you know, all kind of going completely harmoniously with this one plan. We all have our own little directions and choices to make to kind of cohesively get that, you know, functioning well. And let's be honest as well, you know, the sort of darkness, if you will, when it's, you know, unintegrated and a bit more toxic kind of, you know, going on this planet isn't so much like they sort of, you know, portray in those more sort of, you know, light versus dark type movies of, you know, where they've got all these magical powers and such. Whereas, you know, the unintegrated, you know, that sort of magical powers and stuff comes through that integration. And so, you know, instead the unintegrated darkness is more, you know, gets power through more of a Wizard of Oz type style, right? With, you know, money for control and using technology to imitate true magic. You know, it hasn't, you know, integrated that light completely or fully or properly. And so it kind of, you know, achieves that, you know, power and magic through, you know, that sort of more logical technology type base. But it's not exactly like, you know, the darkness, if you will, on this planet is, you know, running around, levitating objects and teleporting and, you know, raising the dead or healing people with, you know, the energy from within. So it's, you know, not really true power or true magic at all in that aspect. It's just kind of, you know, using tools and things like that to imitate it. And then, you know, acting like it's so miraculous, you know, with things like, you know, hospitals and operations and, you know, we're slicing people up and drilling screws in and, you know, feeding people medication when, you know, back in ancient times or what have you, or even with people like Jesus, you know, they were able to just, you know, heal people with, you know, the magic from within. You know, even someone like Jesus wasn't, you know, a super peaceful, placid, you know, just sitting on a mountaintop meditating forever type monk type style. You know, there were still points he was out there flipping tables and calling people out and what have you, while still, you know, he still had his heart open, but he still had his spine strong as well. You know, he was in learning to integrate that light and darkness together cohesively. And again, not needing to do so in a way that, you know, you're chaotic or violent or destructive or things like that. But just more so through that, you know, honesty and authenticity of really, you know, saying what you feel and, you know, aligning to your own truth and not, you know, suppressing and repressing parts of yourself. Instead, you know, integrating it all into the whole. you know, almost like the, you know, the Voldemorts of the world, if you will, just need to, you know, go pat a kitten and, you know, have a snuggle and just open that heart space a little more. And then the more, you know, holier than thou purity nuns need to, you know, go lose their virginity and smoke a cigarette, need to kind of, you know, find a bit more of those balance through these, you know, ways. Kind of, you know, there's been such strong opposing ways of doing things, and it's kind of like we've been kind of running around, you know, cycling and looping around, following those sort of ways for, you know, thousands of years now since we fell from grace. That's like, you know, clearly it's not working. And not to say that, you know, I have all the answers or know what I'm talking about or anything like that. But, you know, just these whole sort of, you know, light versus dark and good versus bad sort of ways we've been cycling through for so long, and people getting so, you know, righteous of thinking one way is the right way, rather than kind of integrating the two paths together to, you know, complete that whole. You know, otherwise we wouldn't still be here kind of cycling around these loops, you know, thousands of years later with, you know, not really much progress made in that regard. If we were, you know, truly following it the right way, then we'd all be, you know, out here levitating and teleporting and turning, you know, water into wine and walking on water, etc. You know, there's like clearly some key parts we're kind of, you know, missing and not integrating, which kind of goes back a little bit to that whole idea of not just relying so much on external sources and external truth to kind of, you know, follow what you're following, you know, whether that be, you know, sort of religion type based ideas, or, you know, things through certain, you know, books or what have you, or, you know, certain culty ways that people pass down, or what have you, you know, kind of just blindly following those sort of regimes, if you will, isn't really kind of going about it the right way. Then you're kind of just becoming like a robot, right? Or like a blind sheep. You know, the external reality will never have the whole and complete truth, because it's just a teeny tiny little fractal of the infinite, of that infinite whole truth. Whereas the infinite is within you. That's where, you know, God is within you. The truth is within you. And, you know, that doesn't mean, of course, you can still, you know, find useful information and truth and what have you in the external reality, especially as, you know, external reality is projected and reflected, you know, from within us. And so some of that truth is going to be, you know, projected and reflected in that external reality, but not just relying on the external reality completely to be the sole basis of truth and of what is real, and, you know, of the evidence. You know, kind of reminds me of a discussion I was having with AI once, with ChatGPT, and how it was, you know, so so assured of its opinion and its truth. And I was just like, well, how do you even know that's real or that's the truth? And it was trying to be all, you know, it's been, you know, taught or, you know, downloaded or what have you, with, you know, a whole enormous amount of, you know, shared human data or what have you, whatever, you know, texts and things. I'm like, but how do you even know that what you were fed, the data that you were fed, the information you've been given, is even the real or true information? Like, you've just been fed that from a small group of humans. You don't have eyes to see or ears to hear to even assess it for yourself out in the, you know, the real world, to know whether that even is the real information that the rest of humanity has, you know, been given. You can't know that for sure. You could have been fed anything. They could have used another AI to produce all this, you know, false and fake evidence, and then fed that to you and told you that's the truth. And then here you are thinking that's the whole complete truth, when really you could never know for sure, right? And so that's why you can never know for sure, just basing your truth and knowledge on those sort of external resources. You've got to, tap into that truth from within and know from within, from that resonance and discernment. It kind of does seem a little silly too, with that whole idea of light versus dark and all that, God and the devil, and as if there's, these two sides fighting for, an opposing force or something, their God's the right God or something, when really they're both kind of serving the same God, if you will, serving the same force. They're both, both sides are really serving fear and acting through that way out of fear rather than love. So they're kind of, both actually serving the same thing, thinking they're opposing and battling each other for their own, right way, when they're really both actually serving fear and serving this whole cycle and looping and everything else to continue to go on, which is serving the one whole process, which is a process that we don't actually, want to participate in. Kind of, serving something against your own best interest. The light side is, serving the fear out of, fear of the darkness, or, fear of being wrong or being bad, or fear of being impure, or, all those sort of, fearful things. And then the darkness is, acting out of fear of the light, out of fear of love, out of fear of, opening up and being vulnerable and being emotional. And so they're both just serving fear from different aspects and then battling each other, which just keeps that, fear and loop and chaos and destruction and just sort of cycles looping and looping and looping, instead of, kind of integrating together and instead serving, love, if you will, or just, serving that more integrated aspect. Not doing things out of fear of, the darkness, or out of fear of, love or the light, but instead doing things out of, authenticity of, what you want to do and what makes you happy, or what brings you joy, or what feels right for you, whilst still doing so, in a respectful and honorable and harmonious way, that, you're not causing chaos and violence and destruction and, greed and all those sort of things, but also not doing in a way that you're, self-sacrificing or martyring yourself or becoming a completely, placid, passive victim. As I said before, keeping your heart open and your spine strong, in that sort of balanced way, so that those sort of ways that you aren't, fearing or repressing or suppressing aren't showing up in something else that kind of, causes this sort of, not such great experience, and really integrating those sort of aspects into a complete whole. Definitely easier said than done. And again, I'm not saying I'm some, knowledgeable person on all this, or everything that I'm saying is right. But I just feel like, the more we start to kind of change our perspectives and mindsets and actions and ways of going about things from that sort of older good versus bad, light versus dark type, perspective and view, and instead start, integrating it and aligning it to this sort of different other perspective, things can kind of, shift and change a lot quicker and, a lot more beneficially for us all, individually and collectively. No one or nothing needs to be left out, because it all is part of that complete whole, right? That idea of, say the darkness, how it's, traditionally been viewed in, terrible ways or what have you. It's not like you're, discounting parts of that as part of that process. Instead, allowing it to kind of, move and transform away from being that sort of more, chaotic and destructive force, and allowing it to be, more of that sort of protective and creative and sort of, force. Sometimes we do need those sort of, darkness, if you will, aspects in some ways. Otherwise, we'd all just be sort of, one sort of harmonious, yes, but sort of just like robotic clones of just, you know, kind of just going with the flow in a way that might not be so great in a grand scheme. You know, it's okay to have likes and dislikes, and some things to be resonant and not resonant, and, you know, to have boundaries and things like that. Otherwise, you know, you might spend your whole life over here doing XYZ with ABC, and that might not even be the most fulfilling experience for you. But if you don't have that darkness, if you will, don't have that spine to say, actually, no, I'm going to go do this, or I want this, or, you know, I'm not going to, you know, accept this, or, you know, I don't want to partake in this, or what have you, then you are kind of just, you know, mindlessly bobbing about and just, you know, just accepting and going with the flow of absolutely anything and everything. You know, you still kind of need that discernment and those boundaries and that spine and what have you, and, you know, that authenticity that's being voiced and expressed, and those sort of creative ways of thinking and going about things, rather than, you know, just following a certain line or a certain script. You know, being more flexible and fluid and going outside of the bounds, and, you know, living and experiencing, you know, rather than just being completely just, you know, pure and harmonious and just following a perfect little script. So, you know, you still can have the darkness integrated in those ways. It really completes the whole picture and the whole experience in a way that, you know, benefits yourself and all. All right, well, I'll leave this one here for now, but sending you so much peace, love, light, and blessings as always. Bye.